this is America and this is Texas, one of the country's most conservative states. Christianity is all around, and now it is heading to the classroom because school kids here will have to learn and will be tested on the Bible. But what of that invisible line between church and state? Will this infringe that? And what has it all got to do with elections? There is a lot to unpack here from Texas, but first to Washington, D.C. Here's Alex Marquardt.
Thank you, Phil. The United States was founded with a simple but revolutionary idea. Government should neither establish a religion nor prevent people from practicing one. And that principle has shaped the country for nearly 250 years. But religion has become more visible in American politics and life than it has been in years, from White House faith initiatives and religious liberty policies to debates over Christian nationalism, the role of faith in government, and prayer in public life. The state of Texas, where you just saw Phil, has become a focal point in the national debate over religion because of its new mandate on a Bible-based curricula for public elementary students, despite fierce opposition from many parents and critics. From Fort Worth, here's more from Phil Lavelle.
Churches are everywhere in Texas. Faith is a fact of life for millions. But here, right now, an unholy row about how holy the classroom should be, and the Bible at the heart of it. Big changes are coming. All kids in public schools will have to study the Bible as part of the curriculum.
It's something that'll enrich your child's education.
That's 5.5 million children, grades K through to 12, which is ages 5 to 18.
It is crucial that our kids know the history of the Bible and how it's influenced the world.
Like Jessica's kids, she fully supports it.
The Bible has been in our curriculum for hundreds of years. It's only been recent that it was removed from our curriculum, so it's not really bringing it in for the first time. We're bringing it back. Teachers.
The State Education Board just voted for the change after a heated debate. Pastor Brandon Hall is one of its leading champions.
In order to receive a complete education, you really have to understand, the book that was very foundational to our history, our laws, and our culture in the state of Texas.
Now, to zoom out just for a moment, this is about more than just the Bible. See, Texas has approved a big reading list, and it includes works from people like Charles Dickens, classics from Jane Austen, the works of William Shakespeare, not just the Bible. But for the first time here in the United States, school kids will now have to learn stories and be tested on the likes of David and Goliath, Noah's Ark, and Adam and Eve. And that is just the younger ones. For older children, there will be psalms and passages drawn from both the Old and New Testaments.
Oh, it's terrifying.
A move dividing parents, even those who are religious.
That's my job, is to teach my child about religion. We're going to see more discipline instances rise in our public schools because for the students who maybe feel that they can weaponize the Bible, that it's going to be used against students who are of a different faith or of no faith at all.
That Texas is conservative, that it is overwhelmingly Christian, none of that is a surprise. But that message has been getting louder of late from those in Congress.
Islam is largely alien to American history.
To those with ambitions to be.
America was built by white Christian men that follow Jesus Christ.
To Senate races.
Crooked Ken Paxton is soft on radical Islam.
And now the classrooms, which already have to show the 10 Commandments on the walls. Is this not just all part of living in a conservative state? This is what happens?
Well, I think that part of living in a conservative state that says that they follow the Constitution and value the Constitution means that this is not what happens.
Now, there is a caveat here. See, this will not come into effect until 2030, which is 4 years away. And that leads to the obvious question. Why now? One theory that's been suggested is it is down to politics. Remember, we are in an election year, and this gives conservative candidates something to campaign on ahead of the midterms. The other is the courts, because this will very likely face years of legal challenges, and it could ultimately end up in Washington at the Supreme Court.
What is really important that our students learn? That's the number one thing that we're focused on. It's not political at all.
The line between church and state, always there, though maybe not as visible as some would like anymore. Phil Lavelle, Al Jazeera, Fort Worth, Texas.
And joining me now to discuss this is Melissa Deckman, the CEO of Public Religion Research Institute, and Jerome Kopolsky, who's a research fellow at Georgetown University's Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. Melissa and Jerome, thank you so much for joining me to discuss this very emotional subject. It is a bit of a lightning rod, and perhaps in some ways becoming more so. Melissa, there was a parent in that story there who talked about bringing religion back to the classroom. The president himself, just last month, he said that religion is back in our country, bigger and stronger than it has been in many, many years. How true is that? What does your data show?
Well, I would say that religion isn't necessarily back. We track demographic trends at PRI, and we have found, for example, no increase in the number of Americans who identify as religious. We have found no increase in the number of Americans attending worship services regularly. But I think what Trump is doing is he's signaling to his base. So Trump's base is overwhelmingly made up of conservative Christians, especially white evangelical Protestants. And as we head into the midterms, there's a broad enthusiasm gap. So Democrats seem very pumped to vote in the midterms, Republicans less so. And I think when Trump talks about signaling that religion is back, talking about religious freedom, fighting for the rights of Christian nationalists in some ways, he's really trying to animate his base to go out to vote.
So 2 important points you made there. Church attendance is down, and people who identify as belonging to a certain faith, that's also down.
Yes. So we have found, for example, over the past 2 decades, the number of Americans who identify as religiously unaffiliated has doubled. Now, to be fair, there's been a little bit of a leveling off in the last year or so. We don't see necessarily a growth in more people being religiously unaffiliated. But I think it's important to look at younger generations, because younger generations, almost 4 in 10 younger Americans are religiously unaffiliated. So I think the growth trajectory is pretty limited in some ways.
There was a number that I found interesting, Jerome, that I want to ask you about. Actually, the number of Americans who believe that religion is gaining in influence, that's growing. It's still a minority, according to Pew, at 37%. But Americans believing that religion is gaining in influence seems to be up sharply, according to this poll. Why do you think Americans feel that, Jerome?
Well, I think it's been in the news a lot. I think that this administration in particular is interested in putting religion in the public space. So it doesn't necessarily mean that people are more religious, but they're seeing more religion, particularly from certain political leaders.
And to that point, Melissa, I think that hits the nail on the head, Jerome. America is getting less religious by a number of traditional measures, and yet religion these days can feel more central to politics than ever. So how do you reconcile these two, what would seem like diverging trajectories?
I think they're actually linked pretty closely. So just to give you one statistic, in 1992, about 7 in 10 Americans were white and Christian. Last year, according to our data, we found that it was down to 4 in 10. So the demographic of the country, they're really changing. Americans are less religious, they're more racially and ethnically diverse. And I think those things are very threatening to certain conservative Christians who are primarily white, who see the country changing in ways they don't like. And so it spurred them into being more active in politics. And they found a home within the Republican Party. We have a system in this country that's two-party, for better or for worse, but it essentially means that activists can play a big role in shaping who are the nominees for their party. And so you've seen really a rightward shift, especially a religiously rightward shift among the Republican Party. So we do see more religion in politics, certainly on one side of the aisle.
And the religiosity of members of each party, correct me if I'm wrong, it appears to be relatively flat among Republicans, as in the past 2 decades, the number who say that they're religious is essentially the same, whereas there's been a steep drop-off among Democrats.
I think that's a good way to think about it. So, for example, today, going back to that number of white Christians, we find that among Republicans, it's nearly 2/3. It's only about 25% of the Democratic Party. And we find also among Democrats, they're far more likely to be secular or unaffiliated. In fact, 3 times as likely as Republicans. That's not to say, however, that there aren't religious folks within the Democratic Party. In fact, a big base of the party are Christians of color, especially Black Protestants. I think a better way to think about it is within the Democratic Party, you have a wide variety of people of faith, including non-Christians, whereas I think within the Republican Party today, you have far more conservative Christians. And so that's where you see the distinction between the two parties.
I want to help our audience understand better the religious diversity of this country, because it has been a part of the history of the United States really since its founding 250 years ago. The U.S. is home to some of the world's most ancient faiths, as well as some newer ones that took root in this country. And here are some stats from the Pew Research Group that paint a portrait of where America stands on faith today. 62% of Americans describe themselves as Christians. 29% say they are unaffiliated, and then another 7% belong to minority religions. Now, within that group of Christians, 39% belong to Protestant denominations, and another 19% are Catholics. The unaffiliated group includes atheists and agnostics, but most say they believe in nothing in particular. The largest minority religions are Judaism at 2%, followed by Islam, Buddhism, and Hinduism, each with 1%. So, Jerome, when we talk about religion and politics, the debates over religion, the prominence of religion in politics, it really does seem like really what we mean is Christianity, in particular Protestant Christianity, maybe Catholic when it comes to certain issues. But how are other faiths part of this conversation?
Well, other faiths have always been part of this conversation. From the very beginning of the European colonial project, there were other faiths who were living in the Americas, both indigenous faiths, but people were brought along in that colonial project as well. So there have always been non-Christians who were in the Americas and part of the United States of America. Now, I think when we look at sort of the contemporary scene, there are many Jews, many Muslims, many Buddhists, many Hindus, many Sikhs, many members of smaller, perhaps less well-known Christian denominations and sects who are living out their faith and are participating politically. So the notion that America is fundamentally a Christian nation, in a way, covers up a lot of the religious dynamism that has always been part of American history.
Do you agree with Melissa that when you see some of the actions taken, like what we're seeing in Texas, for example, it is a circling of the Christian wagons, a fear or a judgment about some of those other faiths? We heard some of that expressed in that piece.
Yeah, and I'd add one caveat to it, that within that conservative Christian base that is supporting Donald Trump, there's a lot of theological variety, right? So there are the evangelicals who've been sort of an important part of the Republican Party since the late 70s and 80s. There are conservative Catholics, but there are also conservative neo-reform churches that are involved. There are members of what's known as the New Apostolic Reformation, these charismatic Christian groups that are historically sort of non-denominational. So the idea that we can lump sort of all of sort of Trumpist Christianity into one bucket doesn't really show us the diversity within that coalition, and actually the inner tensions, because they have very different theological views, they have very different social views, and they have very different understandings of what the relationship of church and state and what the proper political order ought to be.
You mentioned this idea that the U.S. is a Christian nation, which of course many people believe, and we hear the phrase Christian nationalism a lot more these days. Melissa, what have you seen in terms of the spike in adherents or sympathizers of that Christian nationalist movement?
Sure. At PRI, we've been measuring the spread of Christian nationalism ideology throughout the country. And we found essentially that about 1 in 10 Americans are strongly adherent to the views of Christian nationalism. The idea that the U.S. should declare the U.S. a Christian state.
Self-defined Christian nationalists?
Yeah, right. Or actually, they're not self-defined. What we do is we ask Americans the extent to which they agree with a number of statements. Okay. So should Christians have dominion over all aspects of society? Is being Christian truly important at being an American? So those kinds of questions. Mm-hmm. And we then characterize Americans based on those views. Again, 1 in 10 are strongly adherent, probably the most, I think, staunchly in support of a theology for the country. Then about another 20% roughly are sympathetic to those views. And so I think we haven't seen, though, in the last couple of years, any growth in that among the American public. And it's important to remember that most Americans actually are not supportive of the idea of mixing church and state more closely.
So you're saying that there is no actual spike in the sympathies for Christian nationalism?
Not necessarily. I think our data are showing over the past 4 years, it's really been remarkably stable. Even though, of course, with the second Trump administration, you see a lot more attention paid to, I think, the intermixing of church and state.
Okay. I really want to get into the discussion over the division between church and state, because that really is highly controversial. This idea of the separation between the government and the church in this country is a cornerstone principle, but it does continue to be debated and tested. Where did it come from, and what does the Constitution actually have to say? Here's Matthew Torres to explain.
separation of church and state, freedom of religion and freedom from religion without government interference, a bedrock of American democracy. And in true democratic fashion, this key foundation has been hotly debated for decades and interpreted in different ways. Texas Republican Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, who is also the chair of President Trump's Religious Liberty Commission, says separation of church and state is not in the Constitution. So what does the Constitution say? Let's look at the First Amendment and what is called the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. They read, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So yes, the Constitution does not explicitly mention the words separation of church and state. That term famously came from one of America's founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson. He described the First Amendment in a letter addressed to the Danbury Baptist Association, concerned about the religious liberty back in 1802. He wrote about building, quote, a wall of separation between church and state. In the landmark 1947 Supreme Court case, Everson v. Board of Education, Justice Hugo Black used the same phrase to argue how the government, federal or state, must not establish or support a church, aid one religion or all religions, coerce people to attend or avoid religious services, or punish people based on their religious beliefs or practices. This interpretation set a precedent for decades to come and influenced cases involving religious liberty and public expressions. Another case that set the tone was Engel versus Vitale in 1962. The court ruled school-sponsored prayers are prohibited and took an even broader view of the Establishment Clause, arguing any type of public promotion of religion, including offering financial aid to religious schools, is a violation. Now, fast forward to 2022, the Supreme Court ruled that a state cannot exclude religious schools from receiving taxpayer-funded tuition assistance. It's one example how over the years, with more conservative judges on the bench, there's been a big constitutional shift.
So, Jerome, we heard there from Matthew that the separation of church and state, that is a phrase from Thomas Jefferson, is not from the Constitution itself. So what do we understand the founders to have actually wanted?
Well, you know, there are a lot of different founders, and some of them wanted different things. But you know, to begin with, there was no church and state to be separated at the time of the founding, at the time of the drafting and ratification of the U.S. Constitution. So there had been a number of church establishments in New England and in the southern colonies, but when the participants in the convention to put together a constitution came together in Philadelphia in 1787, they realized that it was just not practical to have a Church of the United States. There were too many Christian denominations. Even if most of the country was nominally Protestant, there were just too many different kinds of Protestantism. So on the one hand, pragmatically, there was not going to be a Church of the United States. There's also a jurisdictional issue that there were still some state establishments in New England at this time. And finally, there was a sense that it wasn't the government's business to be involved in religion, right? And there was an Enlightenment perspective that was brought to this, but there was also a religious perspective that was brought to this. The notion of a wall between church and state actually comes from a religious tradition. Roger Williams spoke of a wall protecting the garden of religion from the wilderness of the world. And when Jefferson was writing to the Danbury Baptists as president, he was referring to that tradition.
There is a lot of surprise among many who, when they find out that there is no mention of Christianity, Melissa, in the Constitution. How wide is that gap between what people think the founders intended and wanted and what they actually wrote?
Well, I think it's been a cottage industry among many people in the Christian right for a long time to basically paint this narrative that America was indeed founded as a Christian nation. And I think that those histories, as they are, tend to cherry pick certain figures, and they seem to promote the views of certain figures. And they point also to early state constitutions where you did have an established state-sponsored religion. And so I think for some people, if that's your only source of data and information about kind of the role of religion in the founding, it's a pretty narrow perspective and one that really sort of doesn't get upheld once you start looking at more history in terms of the complexity of the issue here. But I always point to the Constitution's Article 6, which says there should be no religious test, for example, for holding religious office. So I think the founders, driven largely by very great Enlightenment principles that really promoted, I think, freedom of religion, freedom of expression, really knew that it would be dangerous, looking at European kind of examples where you had too much involvement of a national government sponsoring a state religion.
So when we look at what's happening in Texas, and as we heard in Phil's story, every grade, kindergarten through 12th, is going to have some kind of biblical education, reading of biblical excerpts, tested on it. This has obviously been deeply controversial, Jerome, but when it comes to the unconstitutional argument, how strong is that?
Well, I think this is really going to depend on what what Texas wants to do. There were historically in American public schools Bible readings. And these Bible readings were not uncontroversial. And a major reason why they were controversial was because people read different Bibles, different Bible translations, right? Are we going to read from a Protestant translation, the King James Version? Are we going to read from a Catholic translation? Are we going to read from a Jewish translation? So the Bible is not a neutral document. So the question is, how is the Bible taught? Is the Bible taught as one of many sources of our culture and civilization, or is the Bible being taught as a fundamentally religious source? And I think that's something that will be adjudicated in the courts, and it will be something that will be adjudicated by American citizens as well.
And as you've noted, Melissa, this is kind of out of step with some of the declining numbers that we've seen. Are we seeing states taking sort of the reverse path from what Texas is doing, taking religion more out of schools?
I think it probably depends on the state. We have 50 states, right? We have, and with education in particular, it's very devolved from the federal government.
Right.
In fact, one of the things that Trump did when he first was inaugurated the second term is he abolished the Department of Education, because conservatives have always felt that there should be more, that really those decisions should be left to localities and to states. And so I think what you're going to see is really sort of a diversity. I think many states that are kind of typically blue, I think are going to lean more toward, not including the Bible or having the Bible be taught in a certain way. I mean, look, it's part of literature. There are historic reasons to study it. But I think in red states, you have states like Texas pushing the envelope to really have the courts revisit the decision they made in the 1960s that really overturned forced Bible reading in public classrooms.
There was a pretty stunning statistic I read about Donald Trump, and I want to get into your perceptions of his faith, that only 5% of white evangelicals and only 8% of Republicans believe that he is very religious. So as a president, Jerome, how do you think Donald Trump has approached and currently treats religion?
Well, I think Donald Trump treats religion as something that's very useful. I think he sees that he has a great deal of support among people who take religion very seriously and who want their religion to be promoted in the public sphere. I think that there are also people who are coming from religious backgrounds who, although they do not see Donald Trump as a particularly religious person, see him as an agent of providence, as someone who has been picked by God for a particular purpose. So you may have heard sort of the Cyrus candidate back in 2016 when he ran for the first time. So on the one hand, there's something paradoxical about people who are extremely religious looking at this defiantly non-religious figure as a leader, but it kind of works into their worldview and their theology as well. And he's seen it as a very useful and stable group of support.
Yeah, Melissa, I see you
to
nodding.
add to that, we had asked a question right after the 2024 election. We asked essentially, do you think God ordained Donald Trump to win this election? And most Americans say no, like only 25%. But white evangelical Protestants, 6 in 10, endorsed that idea. So they view him as a champion, even though personally he isn't exactly pious, I would say. But he's delivered for them in terms of policy and in terms of rhetoric. I think those things really make his evangelical base quite happy.
He's a means to an end?
Exactly.
And we've seen that play out in the Supreme Court.
No, of course. I mean, his 3 appointees overturned, for example, Roe versus Wade and the Dobbs decision and let that decision go back to the states. And we've seen also other court decisions that have started to kind of break down that separation of church and state, allowing, for example, a high school football coach to lead prayer, in a public high school. So I think the court is really inching toward having a greater role for religion to play in the public square, which is sort of counterintuitive, or it's basically different than what we saw in the 20th century when you saw those establishment principles being enacted, I think, more firmly.
So here we are, 250 years on, a country that was founded not on establishing religion, but not infringing on anyone's right to practice either. Jerome, we only have about 45 seconds left, but now this country is having one of its largest arguments about faith in generations. So where do you think it goes from here?
Well, I think we'll have to wait and see. I think the coming elections, both in November and then in 2028, will sort of show how some of these things are playing out. But it is, I think, clear that this administration, the people who support this administration, see this as an opportunity to make America a more culturally conservative religious place.
Just 15 seconds left. Go ahead.
Yeah, I would say too. I mean, there's really no indication that the country is moving toward these ideas of even promoting a theocracy, which you hear on some voices on the right. But I think right now, in the near future, this movement is a very big part of the Republican base. So I don't see these arguments disappearing anytime soon.
All right, Melissa Deckman, the CEO of PRRI, and Jerome Kopolsky, the research fellow at Georgetown's Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. Thank you both for joining me on this very sensitive subject. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
And that's all from me and the team here in Washington. Handing it back now to Al Jazeera's global headquarters in Doha.